When I first moved to Canada from the US, it was to attend college. One evening, as I was walking back on campus in the heart of winter with Christmas approaching, I experienced a moment that will stay with me forever. The dark days of winter mean that by 3 p.m., the sky was already blackened by thick clouds and heavy snowfall. Everything felt depressing, and I found myself lost in my own world, spending most of my time plugged into my phone and listening to music. I had a pair of normal corded headphones that I would use to play my playlist on repeat. Every day after classes, I would walk back to my student house just off campus. Our landlord was terrible and never fixed anything broken inside our flats. On this particular evening, I must have left the library around 4:30 p.m. after studying hard for upcoming tests. My whole life was running on this schedule. I had relocated to Canada and left all my friends and family behind, so failing these tests was not an option. That night I stayed late with my friend Pam to do as much studying as possible. This particular night, she wasn't there. I can't recall the reason, but she had a prior commitment. As the library was closing, I gathered my things. It always seemed odd to me that the library on campus closed so early. It must have been around 4:30 in the evening, and it was freezing cold outside. When I stepped out of the door, it was pitch black except for the streetlights and a thin layer of snow from the previous days. I reached into my pocket to grab my phone, turned on my playlist, and put in my earphones before beginning my walk back to campus. I had made this walk countless times before. It was like second nature to me. I often found myself lost in thought, completely unaware of my surroundings. I knew the route home like the back of my hand and didn't even need to look up most of the time. There were only 2 main roads I needed to cross, and once I pressed the button at the stop sign, it was just a matter of waiting for the signal to change. Once off campus, I was halfway home. The main road was next, followed by a few smaller roads that led to various neighborhoods. This is where most of the student housing was located, although some people did live on campus as part of their housing arrangements. All in all, it was a rather uneventful walk home, just a routine journey I had taken many times before. I decided against that option because I didn't want to add even more student loans to the ones I was already managing. Working all weekend was tough, but it meant that I wouldn't have as much debt once I finally graduated. As I reached the main road, I pressed the crosswalk button and waited for the signal. The green man appeared, so I looked both ways and carefully made my way across the icy, slippery street. It seemed like the trucks had been out to salt most of the roads, but there were still some stones and sand scattered about for better traction while walking. Even though I was being cautious, I couldn't help but notice a light dusting of snow falling on my hat. It was more like sleet than heavy snow, but it reminded me that I needed to get home before freezing to death. Back home in the US, our winters were mild, but Canada's winters were a whole different level. Once I crossed 2 smaller roads, I would be back at home. As I walked, thoughts of what I could make for dinner started forming in my mind, while Ed Sheeran's music blasted through my headphones at maximum volume. Out of the corner of my eye, something caught my attention as I approached a second intersection. A van moving unusually slow from the left side of the road. I did notice it, but initially I shrugged it off. I couldn't remember my exact thoughts at the time, but it must have been something along the lines of, "Oh, they must be lost." It was a white van, or maybe more of a gray color, but it resembled a worker's van, perhaps for an electrician, builder, or plumber who was trying to find a house to work on. Despite my attempts to ignore it, there were red flags waving in my mind. So I decided to take out my earphones and turn off my playlist on my phone. I put everything back in my pocket, including the corded headphones. I continued walking without headphones for the rest of the block. The van was still behind me, and now I could see that there was a man inside. There was also a passenger, but I couldn't tell if they were male or female, or who they even were. Both of them seemed to be staring in my direction, and they didn't seem lost at all. You know that look people give when they're lost. They look around, point at things, pretend to look at their phones or maps. Well, these people weren't doing any of that. They weren't looking around or playing with their phones. They weren't even looking at a map. As I reached the first of 2 neighborhood streets I needed to cross, the van almost meets directly with me as I'm about to step onto the road. As I stood on the side of the road, the sun beating down on me and sweat trickling down my neck. I waited for someone to wave me across. The sound of cars rushing by filled my ears, the scent of exhaust filling my nose. Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up next to me, its windows tinted and reflecting the bright sunlight. The driver rolled down his window and shouted something incoherent over to me, his thick Italian accent immediately apparent. Peering into the car, I noticed another man in the passenger seat who bore a striking resemblance to the driver: dark hair, well-groomed beard, and a deep tan complexion. They looked like your typical Italian guys, but there was something off about them that gave me an uneasy feeling. They asked for directions to a place I had never heard of before, their intense gazes making me feel like they were studying every move I made. Despite being a long-time resident of this area and well-traveled, I couldn't recall ever hearing of this location they were asking about. Not wanting to get too close to their ominous-looking van, I stayed in the middle of the road as I racked my brain for a response. But no matter how hard I tried, all I could come up with was a feeble apology for not knowing. In a desperate attempt to appear helpful, I pointed straight ahead and asked where exactly it was they were trying to find. Their eyes traveled over my body in a slow, unsettling manner. My skin crawled with discomfort as I tried to maintain my composure. Finally, gathering enough courage, I spoke up and explained that I needed to get back home. Stepping out of the van's path, I made my way onto the safety of the sidewalk. As I walked towards my house, I could hear the van idling behind me, its engine still running. My senses were on high alert, listening for any indication that the occupants were getting out or approaching me, but all remained quiet. I scolded myself for being so paranoid and overthinking the situation. They were probably just lost and trying to find their way. Nevertheless, I quickened my pace and didn't dare look back, not even over my shoulder. As I reached the final crossing before my house, I saw the van had turned onto the same road as me. It seemed like they had taken a shortcut through the neighborhood, and now they were coming up from behind me again. The driver had chosen to take the second road within our housing estate, which formed a loop at the top before exiting back onto the main road. My heart pounded as they caught up to me once more. Did they know where I lived? Were they following me? All sorts of terrifying thoughts raced through my mind as I finally made it to my street. Without hesitation, I turned onto it and headed straight for my house. The van continued on past me, taking the first exit out of the estate. Relief flooded through me as I realized they were just passing through and had no intentions of harming me. Still shaken, I quickly made my way inside and locked all the doors and windows behind me, vowing to never walk alone in that neighborhood again. As I glanced back, I could see that the group of men following me were still a considerable distance away, a few hundred meters at least. With adrenaline pumping through my veins, I seized this opportunity and quickened my pace to almost a run. The last road was ahead of me, and I pushed myself to cross it, nearly slipping on the wet pavement in my haste. My heart was pounding in my chest as I felt my body starting to go numb, not from the cold, but from the fear and anxiety of being pursued by these unknown individuals. My mind raced with thoughts of what they could possibly want from me as I walked along the last road, my destination just beyond a small alleyway that turned left and led to the student house where I was renting a room. Peering over my shoulder, I saw that the gray van was now accelerating in response to my increased speed. The revving engine roared in my ears as the vehicle closed in behind me, its headlights casting eerie shadows on the deserted street. I knew that there was only one way for them to go, towards the dead end at the very end of the second road, where cars could only turn around and make a U-turn. There was nowhere else for them to escape to after this point. I picked up my pace even more, praying that I would reach the alleyway before they caught up to me. My feet pounded against the pavement as I desperately tried to put more distance between us. Finally, their van's loud engine was right behind me, and I could hear it getting closer with each passing second. Instinctively, I stepped aside and turned towards them, putting as much space between us as possible by moving closer to the edge of the sidewalk. As I turned, I came face to face with the same man who had approached me earlier. This time he was on the wrong side of the road with his window rolled down, his gaze fixed on me with a menacing look. My mind raced with fear and uncertainty as I wondered what they were planning to do next. In that moment, all I could do was try to put more space between us and hope for the best. The frigid air bit at my skin, causing me to shiver as I trudged down the desolate road. Suddenly, a car approached and pulled up beside me. The driver called out in a concerned yet unconvincing tone, offering me a ride. It felt like the start of a horror movie, a stranger trying to lure in their victim with false kindness. I declined the offer, on high alert for any signs of danger. The man's words only added to my suspicions, claiming it was cold and he was worried for me. It was like a serial killer trying to justify their actions by pretending to care about their victim's well-being. I could see right through his facade. As I continued walking, the man's last words echoed in my mind. They had an ominous tone that made my skin crawl. He warned me about getting frostbite, but there was something sinister behind his words. Thankfully, the man drove off and left me alone. I let out a sigh of relief and focused on getting home safely. But the encounter stayed with me, lingering in my thoughts. When I finally arrived home, I couldn't wait to tell my housemates what had happened. Some believed me, while others thought I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that lingered after encountering those creepy men on the road. Living with 5 other housemates, 2 of them dismissed my story and believed the men were simply trying to help me find shelter from the cold. But something in my gut told me otherwise. After all, you can never be too careful when it comes to strangers on a deserted road at night. Among my 3 housemates, the trio of girls were the most cautious and serious. They advised me to use Uber or ask for rides to and from college instead of walking, especially in light of recent events. I didn't want to take any chances, so I stopped staying out late and made sure to have a bed ready for me back home. But even though I pushed the creepy guys out of my mind, their presence lingered and troubled me. Yet as the hours passed by, my thoughts were filled with TV shows, social media updates, texting friends, and studying for upcoming exams. That is, until 1 o'clock in the morning. On most nights, I would go to bed around 11 or 10:30, an early night for me. But this particular night, I had gone to bed at 10 due to the stress of dealing with the creepy guys and managing my school workload. After getting a few hours of sleep, maybe 3 or 4 at most, I was abruptly awoken by a noise outside my second-floor bedroom window. From this vantage point, I could see the front of our house below me. It may seem strange that my room is on the second floor and overlooks the front of the house, but it's because there is a protruding section underneath that expands beyond the lower level. Through my window, I could make out part of the road, the pathway leading up to our house and the nearby alleyway. The sound that woke me sounded like car doors shutting. At first, I wasn't too concerned, but then I remembered what had happened recently and decided to take a closer look. Glancing out the window at the time, 1:30 in the morning, only added to my unease. The silence of the night was shattered by an unexpected noise, the blaring sound of a van's engine. It was unusual for such commotion to occur on a quiet Friday night, or any weekend with students around. Curiosity and concern took hold of me, and I reluctantly pulled aside one of my blinds to see what was causing the disturbance. What I saw was enough to make my blood run cold. The same ominous van from before parked right outside my house, and inside the same 2 men who had been there before staring directly up at my window. In a state of shock, I stumbled backwards and nearly fell onto my bed. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my phone, immediately dialing 911 as if it were second nature. Adrenaline surged through my body as I rushed to lock my door, something I had become too comfortable to do with my housemates around. But now, with this unsettling presence outside, I wasn't taking any chances. After dialing 911, I waited anxiously for the call to connect. When it did, my voice shook as I explained the situation to the responder on the other end. There were 2 men outside my home, and they seemed to be watching me. To my surprise, the police arrived within minutes. The van remained parked outside, seemingly undisturbed by their presence. I watched from behind the safety of locked doors as the police spoke with the men in the van. They stood at the edge of the vehicle's window, engaged in some sort of conversation that I couldn't hear. After a few minutes, they walked away and came towards my front door. With shaky hands, I unlocked and opened the door for them without hesitation. It was better than having them ring or knock and potentially disturb my sleeping housemates. Looking back on it later, it seemed like such a foolish move on my part, not wanting to wake up my housemates when my own safety was potentially at risk. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, a feeling of helplessness washing over me like a wave. Yet despite the fear coursing through my veins, I chose to face it alone. My hands shook as I dialed 911, hoping that help would come soon. But when the officer finally arrived and entered my home, I was still trembling in my flimsy nightclothes, struggling to catch my breath. I didn't want the officer to see me like this, but he insisted on stepping inside and closing the door behind him. As he spoke to me, his voice calm and reassuring, he explained that the two men who had been causing me so much distress actually lived in the house next door. They showed their IDs, answered all his questions, and it turned out they were just moving in for their first day. To my surprise, they were not students as I had assumed, but adults renting a room with some students. Despite this revelation, I couldn't shake off the uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. For weeks, even months after that incident, I made sure to always get taxis or Ubers directly from my front door. I never saw those men again, their odd hours and strange behavior making me wary. Looking back, it could have just been an innocent misunderstanding on my part, but at the time it felt very real and dangerous. It was as if all my worst fears had manifested in those two men next door. No matter how harmless others may have perceived it to be, to me it was a truly frightening experience that lingered in my mind like a haunting ghost.